From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. The party's just getting started next door, and we're those neighbors peering wistfully through the drawn curtains of lockdown. America's biggest city, the worst hit by the devastation of the pandemic, is reopening again. Starting this week, New York is back in business. It might not be a full return to normal, but the parks and the streets are filling up with people and many masks are coming off. Here in Toronto, with cases up and vaccines low until recently, we can't help but hope that we can have our summer too, or some of it. For now, Premier Ford did say that we can have golf courses back. The Star's DC Bureau Chief Ed Keenan has been in the Big Apple capturing all that post-lockdown joy, and he joins me now to make us all just a little bit jealous. Hi, Ed. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. It's a strange and fascinating experience here in New York City where they're reopening this week.
Yes, it's strange for us watching from here as well. I've been seeing some really amazing videos that you've been putting up. Paint for me a little bit the scene that you've been reporting on. What does it look like when New York reopens?
Well, I mean, it looks a little bit like a street party. And, to some extent, New York City has always traditionally been like that. And by New York City's standards, it's not particularly crowded out in the streets. When I've been in Times Square before, it was often like a mosh pit, like people just shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalk. It wasn't quite like that, but people were kind of making up for it in enthusiasm. Especially in Times Square last night, I saw there's like a loudspeaker DJ booth and there are hundreds of people out in the square. And a bunch of them broke into choreographed dance moves to one song. And other people were standing along the side blowing whistles and bouncing basketballs. And at one point, a whole big stretch of Broadway got spontaneously shut down by the traffic lanes that are open, by guys on bikes, and other people on bicycles and on motorbikes were doing a kind of like Papa Wheelie drag race up and down the strip for probably 10 minutes while everybody stood around and cheered. People are out, and many of them not wearing masks, because in addition to all of the sort of capacity limits on bars and restaurants and most other businesses being completely limited, indoor dining is back and all of that, the state government here also lifted the mask mandate for people who are vaccinated, and it's basically an honor system. And so, people showing their faces, smiling at each other for the first time in a long time, especially out on patios, in parks, not just Times Square, but Central Park was full of people spread out on the lawns, participating in group yoga classes. The sort of rec league softball games are back on in Central Park, and people are jogging and running. Down in Washington Square Park, I saw, that's in Greenwich Village, and it was packed with people, like really packed with people. There was like a concert for children, and mothers and children were out on blankets watching and singing along. There were professional looking dance troupe practicing their choreography in the center of the square. And there were all these New York University graduates in their caps and gowns who'd just come from the ceremony yesterday, many of them climbing into the fountain, drinking champagne, having a big party in the streets. They're celebrating the end of their university slog, but it felt like an appropriate celebration for New York City, which was so hard hit, kind of emerging from its COVID slog, or at least hoping it has finally emerged.
And that's exactly what I do want to ask you about later, what a contrast this has been. And it just sounds like the world's most awesome party. And it's great to hear that we can see people's faces again. I've become quite the expert reader of eyes in the meantime. You talked about the opening and some of the reopening of restaurants and bars. What's that like? Is it completely reopened now, or is it partial with some conditions? And what's it like to actually be in a restaurant or go to a bar? Like, I think I've forgotten entirely.
So essentially, the capacity limits indoors have been entirely lifted for bars and restaurants. There's still some idea that they should keep tables 6 feet apart, or people seated at tables 6 feet apart, although it's actually kind of foggy. But there's no mask mandate indoors by the government. You can go into a bar, sit up at the bar, have a drink. And it's a strange thing. I went to Junior's Deli and I said to the waitress, like, I almost forget how to do this. And she said, is this your first time being in a restaurant, which is a strange question. But then she said, how long has it been? And I was thinking the last time I sat down inside a restaurant to eat was probably last March, like March 2020. And it felt a bit bizarre. And I think walking around yesterday up and down that Manhattan and going out last night to a bunch of, I popped my head into a bunch of different bars around Times Square. The patios are full, right? The temperature here was like 30 degrees Celsius too. So it's blazing summer temperature. But people have really embraced the patio dining. Indoors, even though there weren't capacity limits, it was a bit more scattered. It looked like a slow night from the before times where, you've got half a dozen people at a bar, every third or fourth table has a few people at it. The indoor dining is back officially, but as we were saying, it still feels wrong, I think, to a lot of people, and they'll take their time easing back into it, I think.
We'll be right back. It's been more than a year of social conditioning as well that we will have to get back used to when things go back to normal. I wonder if you were making comparisons in your head in a way while you were observing all of this. It's a time of healing and vaccine confidence there, it seems. And just until last year, Canada was watching with horror while having a relative grip on COVID on this side. Did it make you wonder, how did things make a U-turn so quickly, it seems, for both sides? Was it the vaccination rollout that panned out differently and we ended up on different sides of the lockdown?
Yeah, I mean, my own sense is that that's exactly what happened, that both countries were hit with a wave early this year. And the US wave came first, right, and was getting bad again. But then the vaccine started really getting out to the population. And as you saw vaccination rates climb, you saw infection rates decline, which is what you'd expect, but maybe even faster than some people thought. And I think it's not entirely Canada's fault, from what I can tell, that its vaccination supplies rolled in a little bit more slowly. Partly the United States was blocking American manufacturers from shipping vaccines Canada had bought and paid for up into Canada. But my sense, talking to people and following in the Star, is that the vaccines are arriving there now, that the supply is coming. And so I feel like at a time where we're watching Toronto and Ontario suffer through a really difficult time with infections and having struggled a little bit with vaccination hiccups, it feels like there's a message from the future here that in just a few weeks or a month or two, I expect that the scene in Canada will be very similar to where it is here, where when you get up to, close to half of people fully vaccinated or close to half of adults fully vaccinated, it really seems to change the dynamics of how the disease spread. And then, of course, that changes the dynamics of what you can do and how you can behave.
And let's just hope it's a message from not too far off a future for us. Meanwhile, we're going to have to continue to live vicariously through your reporting and through the celebrations of the New Yorkers that we've been seeing. Tell me, what was the mood like? Does the promise of the vaccine and the healing melt the heart of even the most cynical New Yorker? Are people hopeful and happy? Or are there still some apprehensions that this is not over yet?
Yeah, I mean, there's a mixture of joy and relief, and then still that anxiety in the back of people's minds. I mean, I was talking to one woman in Central Park who was talking about how small apartments here are, and she lives alone, and she had, spent months basically locked up in her apartment, unable to really see too many other people, terrified for a long time that, the building's air conditioning system or the elevators or the hallways were going to give her the virus. And, just getting outside, just being able to go back to some semblance of life in a city where most people's, backyard and even their kitchen and dining room are the city outside, right? Was just a tremendous relief. And the people I spoke to who are fully vaccinated felt fairly confident that their vaccines would protect them. But there's still this nagging sense. At a time where almost half of adults are still not fully vaccinated yet, variants could come, the disease could ramp up again. And yet it's almost unthinkable at this point. How would you shut the city down again, right? There's all this pent up for so long, and then this great sense of relief, and that nagging anxiety, inability to just really believe that it's over. I think it'll have to be months until that nagging anxiety really goes away.
You mentioned the vaccination process and that a lot of people are still not vaccinated yet. What does this look like there, and how do we compare that to what's been happening in Canada until just a while ago? A lot of people were calling it the Hunger Games of vaccination over here. So how's the process going?
Yeah, and where I live in Washington, D.C., they used the term Hunger Games a lot, I'd say 2 to 3 months ago when the vaccines were first coming out and there were lists of who was eligible. Signing up was quite an ordeal, especially in Washington, D.C. itself. You had to use an online registration system that was really complicated and difficult. And it was reminiscent of trying to sign up for rep programs in Toronto, where you'd get multiple computers out and try and log in repeatedly for hours. That has disappeared here in New York and in Washington and most of the United States, where there's an abundant supply of vaccines available. My 2 children in the Washington area were both vaccinated yesterday. 2 of my children, that are over 12, were both vaccinated yesterday. They became eligible late last week. We called and made an appointment at the local drugstore. We got one in just a few days. They went. Here in New York, I saw mobile walk-up vaccine clinics on the street with people out beside them saying, step right up. We got the J&J vaccine here. 1 shot, you're done. And, there's no lineups or anything there. They had empty seats at the table. So, that shows that at this point, when not everybody is vaccinated, the push is going to be to make it. The reasons people are not vaccinated now are not that they can't get vaccinated. In most of the United States, the vaccines are available in abundant supplies. They're fairly easy to get. So it's a matter of sort of bringing the vaccines to them, to the places where they live, to make it really easy for them. And then convincing some of the skeptics. I mean, there are some vaccine deniers in both countries, I think, who are never going to get vaccinated. They don't believe it's safe, or they have whatever ideological objection. But I think there's a large group of people who you have to make it easy for, and they have to see after a few weeks or months that their friends, are enjoying life and are not sick, and that it's working out well for them. And so that's going to be an ongoing process.
And obviously, these are such happy moments to witness for us all. But some of us here in Toronto obviously can't help but also be wistful as we are still in lockdown. We're trying to get to the same place. How do we process this as a painful reminder of where we could have been, or like you say, a postcard from a possible future that might not be too far off?
Yeah, I mean, I hope what people in Toronto are taking from it is that this is what you've been working towards, and it's probably right around the corner, right? New York, most people knew, because New York was one of the largest North American city that got hit so hard so early. And it was one of the first cities that imposed big stay-at-home orders when Broadway shut down, when Times Square was completely empty. And then a mobile MASH unit, like military hospital, was set up in Central Park because the hospitals were so overwhelmed that they couldn't deal with the number of patients. I mean, we're talking about a year ago, that was the situation. And they struggled through it in waves like everybody else. But this is what it kind of looks like when you come out the other side. And it can happen, it happens what seems like quickly, right? From a big fourth wave here in the US in January and February to a lifting of all the mask restrictions and indoor dining in May. It just kind of happens fairly quickly. And I'm hoping, as Ontario talks about maybe allowing people to play golf again, or go out to, do recreational sports in parks and looks at patios, that you see you're just a couple steps to something closer to what life was like before.
That was a lovely image, and let's end that with a message of hope. Thank you so much for making the time, Ed. And I'm going to let you go so you can go have a drink at a bar for us.
Thanks. I'll raise a glass for you.
Cheers. I was talking to the Toronto Star's Washington, D.C. bureau chief, Ed Keenan. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.